Serious. What is the creepiest experience you have ever had? Posted one day ago. Please do like, share, and subscribe. One time, I was in my room trying to go to sleep when my closed laptop randomly blasted screams of what sounded like a woman in pain. I still have no idea how that happened, but it scared the shit out of me. I grew up in an old farmhouse. It was around 150 years old, must be around 175 now, located in a sparsely populated area in north-central Iowa, very rural. There were a lot of small odd occurrences over the years that my family lived there, but the most frightening one for me occurred when I was a teenager. I was old enough to be home alone, but not old enough to drive. My parents and older sister were all out for the night, so it was just me and the dogs at home. I settled in to watch a movie in the living room located on the first floor of the house when I heard someone walking heavily in the hallway above me. This house had plank wood flooring, nothing remotely insulating, and I'd lived there my whole life and knew its sounds. These steps were distinct, heavy, and unmistakable. I knew I was the only person home, and the house was miles from the closest neighbor, let alone town. My stomach was in a knot, but tried to be logical and quickly decided it must be a dog, even though the steps sounded much too heavy for our small terriers. I leaned forward in the recliner to call for them, but as I leaned forward, I saw that both dogs were already sitting at my feet, and they looked terrified. I took the dogs, the wireless house phone, and ran out of the house and locked myself in my mom's car in the driveway. I called my parents and waited in the car for them to get home. They had both had enough experiences in the house to not doubt me. As a kid, maybe 12, I walked into my mom's room to kiss her goodnight. I didn't realize she was asleep, and as I entered, I woke her. She saw me standing in the doorway and jumped straight out of bed. She grabbed me and threw me onto the bed and tried to choke me out, while kind of clawing at my face. I grabbed a pillow to try to put it between us, but she was on top of me and screaming. I remember seeing her face in the light coming from the hallway, and she was crazed. I kept screaming at her, "It's me," but she wouldn't stop. Somehow, I got out from under her and I ran out into the lounge room where my dad was stood up, about to see what was going on. I grabbed him and threw him between me and my mom, who was right behind me and still clawing at my face. He grabbed her and bear hugged her, while her arms reached out over his shoulders, still clawing at me. I don't know how, but she woke up and immediately started crying, really sobbing and apologizing. She said she was stuck in some sort of not quite asleep, not quite awake state, and when I stood in the doorway, all she could see was that I was wearing her face, and she felt she had to get it off of me. We stayed up all night crying, and I still won't walk in a room if someone is asleep. Went to visit a friend since I had moved away. We were hanging out in the bathroom, and I saw her brother walk by and down the stairs. A couple of minutes passed, and I asked if her brother was off. She said no, he's at work right now. I told her no, I just saw him pass by us, and he was wearing his sweatpants. He was in fact at work. When he got home, the first thing he said was, "You could see it too." His room was the only room that was ice cold. His mom ran sage through the house, and after that his room went back to being warm. His parents or sister would never see this figure, but I did. My wife just met this older lady at work while she's in vaccination clinics. The lady is a nurse. My wife is a bylaw officer who is helping out there. They don't know each other at all. Well, they get to talking one lunch, and my wife mentions that I have a food forest. This lady mentions she has pawpaw trees. My wife says, "My husband would love to see your pawpaws." She's super thrilled because this is a rare fruit that nobody would appreciate, so she obviously thinks it's super cool someone even knows what they are. I'm so excited to go see them. I keep bugging my wife to make plans with her, so about 2 weeks later, we do. We're just there chatting about these awesome trees, and she's showing me her gardens. I'm pointing out all her plants. She's loving that I know them. We're really hitting it off, even though there are 3 decades between us in age. Well, all of a sudden, she turns to me and says, "Do you know a Mary? She wants you to know she's proud of you." I swear to God, my heart sunk into my feet. Okay, so I don't believe in ghosts talking to people at all. I'm an engineer, a scientist. It's just not something I believe in. But this lady, she doesn't know my wife at all. She's only known her for 2 weeks. My wife told me so many times since this moment that there is no way this lady could have ever known about my grandmother, her name, nothing. My wife and this lady barely even talked, just that one time at lunch, and she never came up. My wife never talks about my grandmother at work. My grandmother Mary is why I started gardening. She was the heart of our family, a Ukrainian woman who survived concentration camps. came back home to find her family all slaughtered, and left Ukraine for England, then came to Canada. Her husband passed really young, and she never remarried because he was the love of her life. You need to know who Mary was. Everyone who ever met her loved her. She was my baseball team's mascot. She would go up to the other team and tell them that they were going to lose because our team was more handsome. She used to save her bathwater to flush her toilet with. She never had the heat on in her house. She would warm a water bottle to sleep with, and she always gardened. When she died, I felt it so bad, and I started my first garden to try to reconnect to her. And I got kind of addicted to gardening, and just kept planting and planting. And now I have what I call a food forest on my land. I mimic a forest to create an ecosystem, welcome in all the rabbits and squirrels and birds, and every plant is edible. It's a food forest, and when I'm in my food forest, I can honestly feel my grandmother. There is no name that this woman could have said which would have had any impact on me, not like Mary. She said she sometimes gets vibrations and feelings, and things just blurt out of her, and she can't help it. I don't believe in any of that crap, but I'm seriously second-guessing myself now. I've never experienced anything like that. There was no reason for her to say that. We weren't there to do a mystical reading. If anything, there was a reason for her to not say anything because we'd think she's weird. There was just no motive. And even if you did say something like that, to nail the single person who got me into gardening, I still get shivers thinking about it. TLDR. Nice old lady mentioned my grandmother. Mary was proud of me completely out of the blue. No reason or rhyme, and the significance of what we were doing at the time together was very pertinent. So creepy. Sleep paralysis. Was laying in bed after one hell of a day, and the mind was racing like never before. Eventually, the body fell asleep, but the brain didn't, or however the fuck it works. Luckily, I prefer to sleep on my side or face down. That night was face down, so I guess I skipped a lot of the nightmare fuel. Felt a pressure on my back, akin to, say, a large cat laying on your back. Then came the hallucinations. Hoo boy. Dark moving figures in my peripheral vision, odd sounds in an empty house, sensation of touch on my arms and legs. It was a shit night. I worked in a movie theater in a mall that was built in the early 80s, maybe even late 70s. When it was built, there was a body found on the premises that had never been identified. The place was super creepy, and there were a lot of things that happened there, but one of the creepiest was an experience I had in the booth. The projection booth was probably the most haunted part of the building. One night, I was starting a movie which involved threading the projector. I was focusing on getting it done quickly since I was a little late starting, and I heard a male voice call my name from somewhere on the opposite end of the booth. I yelled back in response, "Yeah?" because I wasn't looking in that direction. No one responded. I finished up starting the movie and walked out from between the projectors and yelled, "Hello, yeah?" But I didn't see anyone. I went back downstairs and walked up to the two male ushers and asked them what they wanted. They said they hadn't been in the booth and had no idea what I was talking about. The door to the booth is locked, and the only people with the key were me and the other female manager. The other manager was in the office, and there was no one else there that night. There were a ton of things that happened there, but this is the one that comes to mind as I don't really have an explanation for it. I was at home alone with my dogs, and one of them wouldn't stop barking. She had a shrill, piercing bark. Suddenly, a man's voice yells, "Shut up!" I was on the phone with my mom at the time, and she asked, "Who's there with you?" I said, "No one. I don't know what that was." She told me to GTFO immediately. I didn't. I figured the only person who died while living in the house was my grandpa, and I can't blame his ghost. That dog was being super annoying. When I was younger, I've been walking around with a friend of mine in the middle of the night. We walked over an open field when we suddenly stood in a flickering, extremely bright and somehow dancing light. We both looked around, but there was no light source or something. We ran away, and when we turned around to see if it's still there, it was just gone. Today, we still have no idea what happened back then, and yeah. I'm a security guard in a large office building. When I first started, I was on the graveyard shift 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. It's two guys on shift, and we each take a turn walking the floors at night. Some floors are sectioned into smaller floors, and others span the whole length of the building. The full floors are already a little spooky at night as half the lights are off, and you get that long hallway effect like in The Shining. 90% of the time, nobody is in the building at this point, and the cleaning crew is gone. Every floor is a bit different depending on the company, but most are just row after row of cubicles. This particular night, it was thunderstorming out, so it's absolutely pitch black outside. Getting that house shaking thunder and streaking lightning, whole 9 yards. This floor is an auxiliary space for a company that only sends people 2 or 3 weeks out of the year and is almost always empty. As I am doing my rounds, I'm walking the floor and boom, power goes out of a whole half of the building. I love horror movies and would definitely say I'm not easily scared, but the combination of events is just a bit jarring, and I had only been working here about 3 months. Then, literally not 30 seconds after the power goes out, I hear a sound like a large stack of papers falling over. The sound couldn't have come from more than 5 or 6 cubicles away. Of course, I'm standing there like, fuck, I guess I should see if someone is there. I walked around, peeking a few cubicles. I say out loud, is anyone up here? Nobody. Nothing out of place. When I get back to the command center, I tell my coworker what happened, and he says, yeah, the phones ring off the hook on that floor all the time. One guy had a heart attack and died up there a few years ago. The combination of events was pretty creepy, but obviously everything turned out fine. I do hear the phones go off on that floor in the middle of the night, still, sometimes. My dad was murdered during a botched robbery. It was about 4 a.m. and going out to get in his truck, someone stuck a gun point blank at his eyeball and shot him. Upon getting the call from Denver police, I raced over and saw him slumped over the driver's seat of his truck. Truck had rolled back about 3 feet, and it was a difficult scene for me to have visited. It's never been solved. Years later, I ran into this friend of his named Mondo, and I always had a cold feeling around this guy, and he saw me. We locked eyes, and I never noticed, but his eyes were black. He walked over to me, took out a picture of the same image I had in my head of my dad slumped over his steering wheel, in his wallet. I told the police, but they didn't seem to care a few years later. The part that bugs me is that I can't remember who was there that morning at the crime scene, but I definitely would have known if Mondo was there. Never seen him again, but his solid white hair and black eyes have never left me. I was watching a YouTube video while staying in a smaller beach town in Michigan for a wedding. Don't live there. This video was about strange disappearances and horror stories answered on this subreddit. My dad had just went for a night jog and found one of the missing people posters in a big pile in the woods, like someone had collected them or was going to redistribute them the next day. He tells me this story and I realize it was one of the people talked about in that video. Crazy sense of deja vu and very eerie. I've had sleep paralysis a couple times. I've had what some would call paranormal experiences. I'm very much a skeptic, but the one that stopped my heart and made me question everything. I'd been dating this girl for a few months, and though she was odd and into some questionable stuff, the sex was insanely good and she was way out of my league, so I stuck with it. Even after her little sister said she'd cut my dick off if I ever hurt her sister. Even after my girlfriend told me about her horse rape stories she's jilled off to. Even after seeing her book collection consisting of nothing but occult, true crime, and serial killer autobiographies, and her detailing her stories about wanting to know what it was like to kill someone. Well, one late afternoon we're making out in my car. She's sitting in my lap and I'm looking at the clouds through the moonroof. She's just staring at me. I can see from the corner of my eye, so I turned and looked directly at her. I immediately felt cold, mildly panicked, as I saw black streaks slowly run across her face, starting at her mouth and crawling outward to her neck and hairline. I stopped breathing and closed my eyes, quietly praying in my mind for God to help me. I'm not sure how long she was sitting there, asking what was wrong, but eventually I heard her, and said I had a bad headache that just came on. I took her home, and spent the next few weeks slowly drawing away and making sure she broke up with me. I'm not lying when I say that for 10 years I had recurring thoughts every time I was getting out of the shower for some reason that she'd be waiting with a knife to kill me. She fucked me up, and looking back, it's one of the few experiences in my life I haven't been able to 100% logic my way out of. We almost bought a haunted house, and the reason we didn't is because I asked the ghost or whatever spooky thing was up there to show itself to me if it was real, and then it did. It wasn't supposed to be haunted. It was a pretty normal house, but an amazing price to have been on the market for as long as it had. One of the upstairs bedrooms made my husband and I feel really odd, but we weren't convinced that it was haunted. We went back a second time with our parents, and we did not mention the weird room. After all, it was a nice house. Then, my husband's mother freaked out in the same room, saying it had negative energy. She went outside, and I stayed upstairs to see if I could figure it out. I stood in the doorway and said, "If you're really here, please show yourself to me, and then I'll leave you alone." Several glowing baseball-sized orbs appeared in the middle of the room for a second, spinning quickly around in a circular formation. I took a photo, but it wasn't very impressive, and didn't look like much of what I saw in person. That was enough for me. I ran down the stairs and out of the house. I never found any evidence of anything sinister happening at that address, but I truly believe, as does my husband and mother-in-law, that something was off about one of the upstairs rooms. The house is worth 3 times what it sold for, but I am glad we didn't buy it. I was on vacation in Jamaica several years ago. At the time, I was quite a pothead, so I was really looking forward to smoking weed in Jamaica. On the first day, I met a guy at my resort who said he could sell weed to me. He seemed really hush-hush about it, and I was a little weirded out because I thought weed was legal. The guy himself was also really creepy. He had scars all over his face, super long fingernails, and looked extremely ragged. I didn't understand how he'd gotten into the resort. A couple days later, he saw me again and asked me if I liked to party. I had already told him that I liked to smoke weed, and I assumed that's what he meant. I said yes, and he smiled, looked around, and tried to hand me what looked like a small white bag. I told him no, because I didn't have cash on me yet, as my card was having trouble getting approved in a different nation's ATMs. He insisted and said that I could pay him later, but I was even more adamant that I wouldn't take whatever he was offering until I had money. On my second to last digit, I had finally gotten some cash, and he invited me back to his room. As we entered his room, he kicked out the cleaning lady and took me out to the balcony. As I sat waiting, he pulled out a bag of cocaine the size of my fist. He grabbed a knife and was preparing to open the bag when I freaked out. I told him that he had to have gotten me mixed up with someone else because I just wanted weed. The look he gave me made me think he was going to kill me there. I was genuinely freaking out. He ended up getting some money from me, and I smoked half a blunt with his friends, too. All in all, it was an extremely scary and creepy experience. I started experiencing all the typical haunting stuff: lights flickering, shadows, objects moving, feeling weight on the bed, even being touched. Didn't faze me. Then I saw a demon beast appear outside my window, just waving at me with the most sinister smile, pure evil, something even Hollywood couldn't recreate. That got me. Almost left my apartment without my shoes. When I returned, I was intent on capturing it on video, but it never fully manifested again. I guess it made its point.